So today's lecture will be centered around mental disorder. Our primary focus is bipolar, and we're going to take a cross-disciplinary, a multidisciplinary, a transdisciplinary, and an interdisciplinary approach to mental disorder. So we are approaching mental disorder, or mental diseases, or spectrum, or chronic disorder from quite a peculiar perspective. We're taking a transdisciplinary approach. Transdisciplinary is basically when mutually exclusive disciplines converges, right, to formulate a new conceptual idea, right? Multidisciplinary is when mutually exclusive disciplines converge. Cross-disciplinary studies is when you take an explanatory position of one discipline within the context of another. So we are approaching mental disorder from a cross-disciplinary, a multidisciplinary, and a transdisciplinary, and also an interdisciplinary perspective, which interdisciplinary falls within the category of where mutually exclusive disciplines sort of permeate each other to formulate new ideas or groundbreaking paradigms. So we're taking these approaches and we're exploring multiple disciplines simultaneously. We're looking at mental disorder from a philosophical perspective. We're looking at mental disorders from a psychological perspective. We're looking at mental disorders from a physics perspective. We're looking at mental disorders from a musical perspective, from a musical theoretical perspective, and we're also going to explore mental disorders from a linguistic perspective. We're also going to take the parapsychological phenomenon into consideration. We're going to take a psychopathological analysis. We're also going to take a pathophysiological analysis. We're also going to study mental disorders from a neurological and a cognitive analysis. And last but not least, we are also going to explore the miscellaneous aspect of mental disorder, where we're going to take a number of different variables or variances into consideration. Now, before we get into all these details, this lecture is primarily going to be more of an introduction to mental disorder, because 1 hour is simply not enough time to encapsulate the multifaceted fascination and phenomenon of mental disorder. So let's dive into specifically what exactly is bipolar. You have different sorts of bipolar. You have bipolar 1, which is manic episodes. You have bipolar 2, which is hypomania. You have bipolar, the third bipolar, which is considered cyclothymia or cyclothymia. And then you have bipolar 4, which is atypical, which doesn't technically apply to any of the former. Bipolar 1 is emotional fluctuation. You have extreme polar extremities between emotions. So you're looking at euphoria and dysphoria. There's a sort of disparity between emotional states, and these emotional states are extremities. This is bipolar 1 manic episode. Bipolar 2 hypomania is a milder version of bipolar 1 manic episode, where you have these mood fluctuation between euphoria and dysphoria, but they're not as extreme. Then you have cyclothymia or cyclothymia, which is a milder version of bipolar, where the mood fluctuation tends to oscillate on a day-to-day basis. There's this high rise and fall, this sort of emotional fluctuation that occurs multiple times simultaneously on a day-to-day basis. Then you have atypical, which doesn't fall into any one of the categories. And then we go into areas like comorbid mental disorders, where there's multiple mental disorders that collide and converge simultaneously, where you end up in a predicament where one cancels out each other. A prime example is when high-functioning autism meets bipolar 1 manic episode. One tends to cancel out each other, or there's some profound convergence occurs. That's beside the point. The whole point here is to explore what exactly causes bipolar. There's a whole dichotomic school of thought behind the evolution or the number of prerequisite or preconditions that sort of predicate bipolar. One is a biological predisposition, and there's also environmental factors that are conducive to what induces bipolar. Biological predisposition, meaning that it's genetically affiliated, or it's inherited in the family, or environmental factors in terms of substance abuse, trauma, post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder, insomnia, because bipolar can be induced, or manic episode can be induced through insomnia, primarily if the circadian rhythm is disrupted. Circadian rhythm basically is a sleep moderator, right? And this works with the melatonin, which induces sleep when the sun sets below the horizon. This has to do with the relationship with the melatonin, your pineal gland, your circadian rhythm. When insomnia induced, this can and possibly induce manic episodes. There's a number of different variables that induces mania. Our objective here is not to study the epidemiology of mental disorder, but to try to put into perspective this sort of misconception, this misapprehension, or this misconstrued nature neurotypical individuals have of individuals who are perceived as abnormal, which is not really the case. We're going to explore 10 areas. We're going to take a philosophical approach. From a philosophical perspective, we're going to explore areas like existentialism, epistemology, ontology, metaphysics, phenomenology. We're going to explore ideas like solipsism, intersubjectivity, phenomenology. In fact, let's just get into it specifically. Before I get into these details, there's some things I need to clarify and put into perspective right now. This lecture is centered around a self-referential and empirical analysis only. I would like to reiterate or reiterate. It is centered around a self-referential and empirical analysis only, which is based on subjective experience. This is not inferential, and this is not centered around any sort of theoretical analysis. Again, I repeat, it is self-referential and empirical analysis only. When bipolar goes into manic episode, two cases we are going to focus on primarily here is manic episodes and hypomania, because these are the two cases where you have polar extremities in mood fluctuation, from elation to dysphoria, right, that ascends right back up to euphoria. During manic episode, bipolar cases transcend into 5 emotional states. One is impulsivity, the other is distractibility, the third is disinhibition, the fourth is grandiosity, and the fifth one is pathological compulsion. You have impulsivity, you have distractibility, you have disinhibition, you have grandiosity, and you have pathological compulsion. Let's explain these 5 emotional phenomena that occurs during grandiosity. Impulsivity is an instantaneous reaction or decision making made without any sort of foreknowledge. Impulsivity and intuition are often used interchangeably and out of context, but they are mutually exclusive. Clarification. Intuition is predicated on a sort of foreknowledge, a sort of foreknowing. Somewhere deep in your subconscious, you have a sort of precognitive, intuitive sense of knowing before an intuitive decision is made. With impulsivity, it's a decision that is sort of predicated on a sort of instantaneousness. That's impulsivity. Distractibility is self-explanatory. It is the inability to stay focused. And you have disinhibition. Disinhibition is when a manic is removed from cultural nurturing and social conditioning. Then we have grandiosity. Grandiosity, again, is self-explanatory. It is the augmentation of one's ambition. And then you have pathological compulsion. Pathological compulsion is an abnormal, constant pursuit. Now, we understand that these are the 5 emotional attributes that are induced during manic episodes. Now we're going to take a transdisciplinary, a multidisciplinary, a cross-disciplinary, and an interdisciplinary approach to sort of circumvent a number of fascinating phenomena that occurs with mental disorders or mental disease or just atypical individuals as a collective group. Let's take the philosophical approach. We're going to discuss the philosophical, the psychological, the physics, the music. From a theoretical standpoint, we're going to explore also the linguistics, the parapsychological, the psychopathological, the pathophysiological, the neurocognitive, the neurological and the cognitive, and last but not least, the miscellaneous, where we'll explore a number of different variances. Let's explore the philosophical aspect of mental disorder. Let's talk about solipsism. Solipsism is one of those philosophical ideology that is predicated around the idea of only the mind that exists, and all external stimuli is predicated on some sort of mirrored projection, some sort of mirrored manifestation of projection, or some sort of imagination of some degree. Then you have the idea of intersubjectivity phenomenology. But before we get into intersubjectivity phenomenology, let's explore specifically different sorts of solipsism. One aspect of solipsism says that only the mind exists and other minds cease to exist, which is one of the flaws of solipsism. But then you have epistemological solipsism, which states that I cannot prove that other minds exist. Then you have the metaphysical solipsism, which states that I cannot prove with absolute certainty that other minds exist. Right? During manic episode, bipolar cases tend to adapt or integrate a sort of solipsistic sort of ideology, where their perception of reality become a sort of figment of their imagination, sort of predicated on the merits of the Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where she tumbled down this rabbit hole and she went into La La Land. But their philosophical ideology is not so much solipsistic, because solipsistic is somewhat an unfinished philosophy or a flawed philosophy, because it's a sort of selfish ideology where other minds don't exist. But when you take into account ideas like intersubjectivity phenomenology, where we're looking at minds as a collective group, or we're looking at collective consciousness, how do you, as a solipsist, invalidate that? This is one of the paradoxes of solipsism and intersubjectivity phenomenology, where if only one mind exists, how do you validate intersubjectivity, collective consciousness? Now, whether collective consciousness is objective or subjective is a whole different subject. This is one of the conundrums that bipolar cases are in during grandiosity, augmented ambition, where they believe they are God, they go into the solipsistic sort of phase, right? Then you have the existentialistic despair. Before we get into the existentialistic despair, there's three philosophical areas we need to explore quickly. One is nihilism. Nihilism postulates that the universe has no inherent or no intrinsic meaning, and trying to construct any meaning or value is pretty much useless. Or absurdism postulates the same sort of idea that the universe is meaningless, and trying to construct any meaning is sort of counterproductive or in contradiction to the intrinsic meaninglessness of the universe. Existentialism now postulates the same idea, but has some